Thanks everyone for checking in. My name is Purvia Patel, and I'm a design principal here at Education Elements, coming to you from Arlington, Virginia. I'm really excited to talk with you all about steps that schools and school teams can take to redesign systems for equity.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Crystal Hsu here, design principal with Education Elements. I'm really excited to join. I love seeing everyone's GIF responses between 1 and 3. I think today I'm in a space of 3 because I just love the baby with the spoon. And I'm really excited to engage in a conversation that hopefully extend beyond the hour today and go into the future so we can learn collectively.
Yeah. And so just quick Zoom reminders, we will be using the chat feature a lot. And when you do use it, make sure that you're set to everyone, all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, only Crystal and I will see your responses. And I believe the video and speaking functions are disabled on this, so those aren't really relevant. So thanks, Crystal.
Awesome. So excited to start the conversation around disruption and innovation. What we want to approach the conversation today is first framing like why this is the time now for you to join us and think about capturing the opportunity to start redesigning. We usually see the fundamentals of like what we agree to, what we expect, and what we're in a space right now is like our fundamentals are being challenged with the disruption that is actually creating a space of a lot of unknowns, which is what we call what's next. In examples of this would be when we are thinking about aspects of Borders to Amazon, Blockbuster's survival with Netflix, Safeway to Whole Foods, Yellow Cab's emergence of a disruption with Uber, Marriott to the disruption of Airbnb, and Stanford University to the birth of Khan Academy. And for us, our conversation today is the idea of school as we know it with COVID creates this great opportunity for us to reimagine what is coming up next and how do we think about what is next. And what we want to challenge is we want to make sure we are all thinking about what is next through the lens of equity. And so you see a great quote from Hugh Vasquez from the National Equity Project that talks about since we know that this disturbance is required for change, and there's no doubt that disturbance is happening right now as we speak, the question is, are we actually willing to use this opportunity to create the kind of educational systems we want? And so for us, when we engaged in this thinking for a few months, is that we want to think about now is the time, let's embrace it, and let's take it and capture the opportunity.
So why we're talking about the systems levels. We know that the current inequities that exist within our schools and our society are a result of intentional design decisions made around policies and practices. They didn't come about out of nowhere. And we can see that when we even begin to look at the foundation of our country. Slavery created a foundation where marginalized groups were faced with discrimination based on their race, which has led to very stark systems of oppression that exist when you look at the number of people living in poverty, when you look at the employment barriers for people of color, when you look at access to healthy food for marginalized groups, and the housing discrimination policies that have really led to inequities within our country. And so these practices have over time developed deep inequities for the experiences of children of color within our schools and have influenced all these systems that you see on the right-hand side that exist within them. And so like some examples of like how this could show up, we see that the people in power and those who are making decisions are those who historically held that power as well. So 78% of board members are white, even though 48% of the student population is not. We see that 80% of teachers are not people of color, even though 52% of our student population are students of color. And we see that 57% of students of color attend underperforming high schools, even though they only make up 30% of the student population. So just some small examples of how this like has showed up. Another important point, because these inequities were designed, they can be redesigned. And that's what our charge is for schools and leaders with the paper Crystal introduced. One caveat, though, is that we also not only do have to redesign the systems, we also have to account for the human factor behind those decisions. So people are the ones designing these systems, and they come to spaces with psychological bias, implicit bias, power, privilege, and internalized racism. So that also has to be taken into account.
And so why we're here today is that you'll see this new definition of how we're evolving as we think about educational equity as education elements, and we're defining it as the recognition that barriers that the barriers that marginalized students faces are due to the deliberate actions and bias, and therefore requires us to dedicate a greater amount of resource to remove them for our kids. Looking at our attendees, we know that today we don't just have educators and leaders from the United States, we have an international representation, and we hope that we think about educational equity and would love to build our understanding of it through an international lens as well. So for Porvi and I, and for Education Elements, we've been embarking in this conversation of like, how do we bridge the conversation around the theoretical of what must we do with the tactical of action for something that we do not yet know exists or have seen the future. And so for that, you'll see our paper that is coming out. It's a part 3 of our Return Planning Reimagining Learning white paper that will sort of serve as like a step-by-step guide or protocol that we would work with our districts to sort of roll out, and we want to be able to share with anybody who want to engage in the redesign of school system. And so the experience that you'll have today are sort of going through the steps that we are putting in and that you'll be able to see early next week. And we want to just give you a preview, and we want to give you some examples of how this has looked with some of the school districts that we've been working with in the last few months in doing this, but also at the same time be able to offer the collective wisdom and knowledge to build a cohort of people who want to have this conversation, whether through office hours, whether through online, through Twitter, whether through just being connected and knowing that this is the stuff that's top of mind. And so for us, the idea of this is the audience of this paper is if you are a leader or a team who are sort of in a space where you have to make change on how you fundamentally operate as a school, or you are a leader with and a team that is ultimately wanting to assure that you're providing students what they really need, or if you're just a leader or a team that you are supporting reopening plans and you have a certain area of expertise that you just want to understand how can you support schools for that equity lens. So whether you're someone who is with a specialty on professional development, on health, on transportation, on HR, you are also a part of our audience. And we recognize that principals and leaders might be sitting in a sweet spot where you're given guidelines, and you're told to go forth and make these guidelines become a reality within your schools. And we're saying that because you're in that spot right now, that you are in this absolute pivotal moment where you can actually start making decisions with an equity lens. So you might be a principal that is faced with creating a master staffing or calendar to fit the operational, socio-emotional, and academic needs of all your kids, and you only have 2 weeks to do it, or even a week. Or you might be a principal that you're like, my team and I have identified that parent engagement this fall is really key. We want to think about how we engage our parents because we know that this is a key aspect of making sure return to school is successful in meeting the needs. And you could actually take a multi-month approach to thinking through this equity lens. Regardless of who you are, and where you sit, we're saying that there's different ways for you to sort of engage with the paper. And so the call to action that you're gonna see is, if you've been on our webinars, you've probably seen CPAD. And so we framed it for you right now in like the different ways of how you engage through the depth of the CPAD that you want to go into. So you might just say, Crystal and Porvi, I just want to be sparked. So I'm going to take the approach of joining this webinar, reading this paper, and sort of start sparking my interest and my ideas and my awareness of where I can start capturing the opportunity. You might say, I want to be sparked and I want to expand upon it, meaning not only am I going to read, I'm actually going to like lead my teams through deep discussions about the embedded inequities within our school system or our systems that we have not yet even identified or like unpacked. You might actually say, not only do I want to be expanded, I want to practice starting to redesign, right? So I want to move out of that discussion and theory and go into like, how do we actually create this new structure or the new fundamental system. And so what you'll do is actually take the step-by-step guide and the digital workbook that we'll be releasing, and taking your team and going through connect, include, create to identify the system you want to redesign. And then finally, you might actually say, like, not only am I going to practice redesign it, I'm going to commit to make sure we actually prototype it. So what we design, we're going to do. And we're going to actually put it in place as we're returning to school, to make sure that we designed a system that is for our most marginalized students at the center. And then hopefully that inspires you after going CPAD, that you actually want to do the D, which is actually debrief the entire process, and thinking about that this is the only entry point, and that you can actually continue this iteration using the same protocols and similar approaches. So we wanted to break this down because we know that people are in different spaces, people are in different time frames, and people are different comfort levels to be able to lead this work and engage. And so our next thing is we would actually love for you to be able to share with us where you are currently in that space. And so we will take 1 minute to sort of, for you to have some reflection time, and also for you to get on Twitter and start like connecting with us on how are you hoping to capture the opportunity to redesign school. Are you at Spark? Are you at Expand? Are you at Practice? Are you at Apply? Or are you at Debrief? And if you don't have Twitter, feel free to put it in the chat. The only reason we want it on Twitter is that allows us to have follow-up conversations in the days, months, years hopefully ahead of us, whereas like the chat only allows us to see it in the moment. So you could pick chat or Twitter, but want to just give you this 1 minute to reflect and think about where you are and how you want to capture the opportunity. So for you, you will play us 1 minute of a lovely song. Awesome. Keep on sharing and keep using the chat with making sure you change it to all panelists and attendees. The caveat that typically happen is it's usually just always, it starts at all panelists unless you go and change it physically, but we want to keep hearing your reflections.
Awesome. Okay. So I wanted to kick off by just sharing a general overview of the framework we've outlined within the paper that Crystal mentioned. And it's basically, like we said, like a 3-step guide, or in this case, more like 4-step guide to helping you work through a system that you think needs to be redesigned to be more equitable. So the 3 main steps are connect, include, create. But because of that human factor that I mentioned, that's critical to redesigning systems, we have a step 0 included. That start with yourself and seed power, which is really pushes you to identify your own bias, power, and privilege and how you make decisions. Then it moves into step 1, connect, where you're called on to really unpack a challenge by understanding the experience of those most deeply impacted. So this involves a lot of deep empathy work to understand the everyday lived experience of those who are most impacted. Step 2 is include. This is bringing and including voices to the table, especially stakeholders at the margin that aren't typically given a voice in those spaces. And then the final step is create, design prototypes that create equitable outcomes for all students, using the design principle of making that prototype design for a marginalized group. So we're going to dive into each of these 4 steps throughout this webinar and say a little bit more, and also provide an example as we go to apply each one. So we're going to start with that step 0. We start with our identity because our past experiences and unique understanding of the world really does influence our decision as leaders. And our identities are multifaceted, and each part of our experience and how we experience the world creates assumptions and biases. And so we really want to start by taking time to do that self-reflection and recognize where you might hold a bias, where you hold power, and where you hold privilege. And so that's where the first part of the paper takes you. We have 3 like starter questions to get that reflection going, thinking about how your biases have helped to maintain racism within your school, what are examples of interpersonal racism and how it might play a role in interactions within your school, and how does institutional racism play out within your school. Again, these are starting questions that you can use to start that reflection, and the paper provides a wealth of resources for you to dig in. But once you've gotten that understanding of yourself, the second part of step 0 is seed power. Just want to name like how that might play out. So it can be as simple as like, now that you have that awareness of your biases and the power that you hold, when you go into a new space, just simply asking yourself, like, how do I hold power in this space? And how can I make a very conscious effort to lift up the voices that may not hold power? And so this could be as simple as being the last person to offer an opinion during a staff meeting, or giving spaces for those who you manage to give really transparent and open feedback.
So if you think about that, these are the anchoring reflection questions that we are challenging everyone to start before even jumping into the connecting of the challenge of the system. We also offer in the white paper the resources that you can actually explore to sort of start unpacking these conversations. And so you'll see that they come in 3 buckets. The first one is more about self, the role in which you play and your implicit biases, as well as what you're working on with and how it impacts your decision making, what we call the human factor and how we think about decision making. The second aspect you will look at to be more aware of the power and privilege in which you bring to interrelational racism and interrelational relationship decision-making communication. And we sort of break it up based on white allies and people of color allies. And we know that there are a lot of great resources out there, but we wanted to curate a system or a list of resources to just start the conversation, to spark your unpacking. And the third aspect of this is more about the systems or the resources to help you identify the institutional biases of schools and districts. And this third aspect will look drastically different sometimes based on the system that you want to unpack. So if you were looking at parent engagement, some of the resources can be swapped out to be more inclusive of the institutional biases of parent engagement historically between schools and districts. If you're looking at parent or master schedules, or if you're looking at student engagement, you would switch out those resources, but we provide 9 resources that are good pillars to start the conversation. As you start thinking about your engaging to that, like in the resources and the steps, we called this to be most important step 0 before we go into step 1, because if you don't do this work, you're simply redesigning with the human factors that were already there in the potential first round of decision making or bias around how you think about decisions. So throughout this webinar, you'll see us give you examples of one redesign that we've recently been doing around master schedules. And so here's an example of how step 0 plays out for a group of leaders as they think about master schedules. A group of leader is thinking through the questions of like, 1, what are my beliefs around how time should be spent in the school? 2, where do I hold preferences for what I prioritize in scheduling? And 3, who do I consult when creating the master schedule? After step 0, these are the 3 questions that sort of were highlighted for how they were thinking. And as a result of those highlight, the potential learnings that they can come from it is simply around maybe that they have a group of staff that they consistently go get feedback from, because they either know that they share the same core value or that they know they will actually provide it and prioritize the time. Maybe they asked it in the past and people didn't give them the feedback, so they're starting to narrow in their focus of people they're actually including in the feedback and decisions making cycle. The second one is one like how I would prioritize decisions on how time is spent, right? Maybe I'm making those decisions based on the values I hold and the preferences I hold around education and learning and what that experience may look like. Maybe that's around how you would envision your students feeling or your own child, but that in of itself is a bias that you hold in how you make decisions. And the third thing is you might start realizing that you actually consider the feasibility over the marginalized group needs. So shifting conversations of like, will this actually work? How does it work operationally? Can actually take away the conversation about what does the master schedule must look like for the marginalized group. These are just the beginning steps of step 0, but after going through it, you're starting to uncover like what are the potential biases, whatever the potential power and the privilege that you bring to the conversation that influences how you make design decisions for the system that will actually impact your most marginalized students. And I love the questions that people are sharing in the chat of like, what are the resources you are providing about religious discrimination and et cetera. I think you'll see as we go through the paper list out a lot of different systems in which we can view a lot of marginalization or inequity, and that we name that the exhaustive list of resources does not cover everything, and we hope to be able to follow up with more resources and more examples.
Awesome. Yeah, and I dropped this in the chat just to be like transparent. A lot of our resources do focus in on racism because we saw that as one of the more prevalent root causes across the US. And so we chose that as a starting point to focus on.
And so in the chat, we would love to hear from you as you're thinking about how we talked about step 0, the anchoring reflection questions, and sort of the examples of how step 0 plays out with master schedules. Would love to hear what are some biases that you are aware of within yourself, and how are you thinking it affects the system within your school? And so if you feel open and free, please feel free to share that in the chat, because I think we are learning that this work cannot work in isolation. It's not about the only self-reflection, but it's all about the group effort and the group realization together to push each other's thinking. So take a second and feel free to drop that into the chat. As you're starting to think about your biases, and as you're starting to think about systems, as you're starting to think about, you know, inequities beyond race, know that the resources might be geared right towards, you know, how we see racial inequities play out, but the steps are used to be able to play out any aspects of the different identities and the different discriminations that may happen. So with that, we'll actually go ahead and move on to the next section. And so when we think about the stepping into step 1 and connecting to the challenge, what we pose in our thinking is that we must first connect with the challenge by understanding the experiences of those most deeply impacted. And not necessarily the loudest voices, not less necessarily the average, but those who have been most impacted by the challenge and how it presents for them and why does it matter. And so in step 1 of our white paper, we sort of go through the process of hoping to get to an outcome of how do you actually define the system you need to address, the scope of change you want to actually make, and whom you're actually making the change for. And we hope through this step, you're starting to empathize with with identified school level challenges, not necessarily through the full empathy of the users, but understanding through data and understanding through the challenge. And finally, at the end of Connect, you walk out with understanding, like, are you redesigning for impact? Are you redesigning for urgency? Or are you redesigning for ease? And the fact that, are you redesigning to determine the impact on students based on the urgency of the decisions you have to make right now, or the ease of the change that can actually bring and build collective wins early on? And so Connect takes you through the process of thinking about, 1, determine the information that you actually need to collect to be able to come to that conversation, decide from whom you need to collect the data from, because sometimes we're collecting sources from one place. And 3, we actually want to start engaging with stakeholders to help identify what is the actual problem and sort of leave this place of generalization and start moving to the specific problem statement of the exact system that you're hoping to redesign.
So continue with that example of master scheduling in this step 1 Connect phase. In, again, reference to master scheduling, you might ask yourself questions like, what are the district requirements for master scheduling versus what are aspects that my school has autonomy over? Thinking about what actual choice marginalized students have within their schedule. Reflecting on how you've made decisions prior. Do you make them for policies, or are they more around preferences and your own choices? And then finally, what about the master schedule works for marginalized students, and where does the schedule create inequities for them? So after engaging in questions like that and getting that data that Crystal just named, some potential learnings that you might have as a leader of your school or in that position of creating the master scheduling is you might realize that adult logistics are prioritized over continuity of the student experience. You might find that you plan for certain groups last, such as SPED and EL students. And there might be a realization that there are few permeations of options for electives and advanced courses, resulting in a lack of choice for marginalized groups. And these learnings are just gleaned from Crystal and I's own experiences with supporting schools with master scheduling, if you're wondering where those came from. So we'd love to engage you in the chat again. What is a system that would benefit from deeper connection with stakeholders within your school?
And so as you're sharing that, I'll actually share some of the biases or the experience that people are naming of like, whether it's a bias or a preference or how we're like trained to think, the idea that data drives curriculum, or the idea that around the savior mentality, right? Like, what does it mean to sort of address that? The bias Tracy shared about, you know, doing what I'm used to doing, what my perceived needs are for my community, rather than like maybe opening to hear what is not working from the parents and students that like she serves and be willing to make the necessary adjustments. I think a lot of these, as you're unpacking it, is like helpful to know. And we usually put on, you know, a sticky or put it on something that makes it super prevalent so that we're allowing the people that we trust the most to give us the honest feedback of when we're falling into that pattern. And as you're sharing the systems, love it. If a district continue to go to the go-to group, they will continue to get the same results and will take a huge risk of missing the bias that exists within schools among students, staff, and parents. Love it. Student support systems definitely requires a deeper connection with stakeholders to ensure we are meeting the true non-academic needs through the coordinated support. That's from Tracy. Keep on putting into the chat what are systems that you're thinking about that would benefit from deeper connections with stakeholder.
Yeah. And I think what Zena shared is a great segue into the second step of include. So really often when we sit in a leadership position in a district or a school, it's easy to design for rather than with the people that we serve. And even if we do design with people for whom the system serves, we often are pushed to make decisions based on ease, accountability, and privilege. And so we have to be really intentional about elevating the voices of stakeholders at the margins. So this is very much like thinking about whose voices need to be brought into to the table and be a really real part of the decision making. Who do we need to do more empathy work with to really understand what the challenge is instead of naming for them what we think their challenge is. And letting those stakeholders tell you what success looks like to truly change that system for equity versus, again, like naming for them what you think what success would look like for changing that system. So within that,
here's some examples, right? How we think about it. The reason why we sort of separate the idea of connect and include is that we don't want to create that bias of someone mentioned like, we think we know the problem and we start creating ideas of solving that problem when we haven't actually done the job to connect and also include people in understanding what we're trying to solve for. And so this example of the master schedule is the idea of this group of leaders, once they finished connect and go into include, they started realizing like the questions around whose voice have been traditionally excluded from the conversation, right? Like who's the go-to group and like where everyone else who actually haven't been able to engage. Who are the users at the margin for my specific scheduling needs or master schedule or staffing? Who has the system or challenge failed to serve over time, over the different iterations of the schedules that we've done? And what has worked about the schedule and what has been challenging for this marginalized group? And then starting to engage your stakeholders of those who have been in this at the margin and start asking the question of like creating the safe space of what they want to see and what would success look like. And so this example actually came from once these questions sort of came up and bubbled up and people take the time to like go and do the empathy interviews and start going through the empathy activities and start gathering stakeholder feedback. interviews, mappings, we sort of identified potential learnings. We realized that the master schedules that are being consistently created are marginalizing single parents or parents working multiple jobs. The master schedule is potentially marginalizing and creating a different experience based on what is adult preference for learning time versus student learning time, like best needs for student learning time. And we actually might be creating a schedule, and in this case, we're talking about a virtual master schedule that is actually not meeting the needs if you have multiple students in a family that goes to different schools needing to work on different schedules. And so the idea of this include is to be able to start, now that you know the problem, what steps can you take? What reflections can you do? What communication points can you have to start including people into the understanding and the processing before you actually start creating solutions? If we jump to solutions without going to connect and include, then oftentimes the solutions we make are based on our perceptions, our preferences, our biases, and what we think works. And so this is an example of the evolution of steps 2 for master schedules. And so in the paper, we go into a little bit more of like what are different marginalized groups, what are different data points that will support and help tell the message of the different marginalized groups. But for us, we would love to hear from you, like who are stakeholders at the margin within your context that are currently not a part of your decision making. I can give you some examples as you're doing some thinking. One school district I worked with earlier last week, we were thinking about parent engagement, and they realized that a stakeholder that were at their margins that they haven't been able to engage are parents with transportation limitations, right? So for them, they're like, our ways of engagement is either through an email, through social media, or having parents come to school for different events. Well, the piece around coming to school is actually marginalizing parents who actually don't have a car or have limitations on how they travel. They also named like another group of marginalized stakeholders are, for that particular redesign, is around parents who work multiple jobs, right? That don't have the hours of what we consider the work hours, or the hours in which we're designing for. And so as I'm seeing the systems that you named, Tracy named talent management, right? Stakeholders are like actually the ones who didn't get a job, the ones who are choosing to leave, the ones who haven't felt successful. Systems from the idea of like, how do we actually engage? Like surveys might not be the only way. And so maybe the system you want to redesign are engagement. And based on that, what are the groups that are not engaging and why not? Cindy shared teachers of classes with non-standardized assessment, exactly, or of special needs students are often not considered. Susan named students with technology limitations due to the availability to respond in the surveys or the feedback loop. I love it. So I think this is how we start thinking about like, who is this not working for? Because sometimes the people who are the loudest might be the ones who this is actually working for to a certain degree, but just not perfectly. And so sometimes we've been having a conversation at Educational Elements about, is there a need to purposely exclude in order to purposely include the marginalized voices? And so an activity that we've used for different leadership teams and different discussions is just getting a team together, getting together your leadership team, getting together the people that you surround with as you're thinking about how you make decisions, and going through this roundtable talk. So name what you're trying to do. So in this case, it's like creating return planning task force, and have everyone around the table share one stakeholder that they want to bring to the task force to make the decision. And know that there's only 5 seats at the table. And if you want to put yourself on it, you take up a seat, and have your group go around and discussing why they would put that person and vote on if they would bring that person to the table. The idea is once you get to stakeholder number 6, you start getting a rich conversation of who should come off the table and who should be included. And this will help you sort of even alleviate and highlight what other biases, what other preferences, and what other, influences you're thinking about as you think about who you actually include into the conversation of creating the future for the most marginalized group. And so do this activity. We've done it for school leadership development. We've done it just through an equity conversation. We've done it through thinking through virtual remote learning. And this activity allows people to start unpacking some of the preferences and what we bring. And so with that,
our final step is create. So by now you've gotten a really good, deep understanding of what the challenge is, what the everyday lived experience is. But during create, we want to continue to push you to design with your users rather than for them. And so you can do this by building in intentional cycles for feedback and reflection from stakeholders at the margins as you begin to ideate different solutions. Because we recognize that it might not be possible for them to be like consistently with you at the table. Like if you're like redesigning your system for hiring, yes, it's good to get teacher feedback and parent feedback, but it might not be possible for them to attend all your meetings. So create opportunities for those voices at the margin to be included. Design multiple prototypes for that marginalized group at the center. There shouldn't just be one idea coming out. You can test out 2 to 3 to figure out what works best. And then as Crystal kind of named, like be really clear about the what, like what decision trade-offs did you make?
Oh, he just went behind the trailer.
How to proceed.
They're so pretty.
How to proceed, how the process was used, excuse me, and
he's
why
he's going in the shed.
I'm gonna pause for a second. Leslie, could you mute, please?
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Sorry. Clear communication about your what decision trade-offs you made, your how, the process that you use, that you did this intentional engagement of your stakeholders, and why, your reason for selecting that system that you decided to redesign. And so the questions that you ask in this phase are going to be very much grounded in this process called equity by design that we outline within the paper a little bit on citations down there if you're looking to read some more. But the first is design at the margins. Like really think about this solution that I've created, this prototype I created, who does it serve? Whose needs are unaccounted for? And does this create inclusion belonging for all of my marginalized stakeholders? Make the invisible visible. This is really naming what assumptions we're making as designers and being very transparent and open about like, did we actually redesign the system or are we still upholding underlying systems of inequity? And then the last is speak to the future. Does this prototype or idea create a new equitable ideas or does it simply restate existing systems that were never designed to serve all students to begin with? And this last one can be challenging because we're calling on leaders and we're asking schools to create a reality that doesn't yet exist. We don't yet have an anti-racist school. And so we're using these steps to start to redesign and recreate a future that we all hope to have one day.
So the application of this into like a real life scenario with the master scheduling is once someone is at the step of creating, you see here 2 examples of virtual schedules that we've created in the last few months with schools. One, the one with the blue banners around pre-KK, where they actually design for their parents at the margin who are working parents who actually need to be able to support their kids through their learning. Which that happen is they create AM and PM shifts of learning. And so that kids are not just given one choice of this is when you come to school and this is when you do your learning. The second example of like potential learnings is the for designing for SPED and EL student needs at the front end. It created prioritization for how the rest of the staffing decisions are made. And so you hear for the gray banner is how you can see decisions are being made as a result that are primarily driven by the needs of SPED and EL students. And so for us, it's a way of creating and a way for us to think through solutions for the margin and not the average. Because oftentimes, in my experience as a school leader making master schedules, we sometimes start thinking about the operational, even though our intent is through the needs of all students. And so this allows you to communicate, like, here's what we designed for, here's why, here's how they've been marginalized based on data, and here's what we're trying as a result of that. And so it allows for you to create a solution that is more for the actual problem versus a solution for the generalized need. And so for that, we know that we went very high level and very quick around our steps of seating power, connect, include, and create. So we want to give you this time.
So what questions do you have about this process? Recognizing that we went over it pretty quickly, but do you have any questions about any of the steps? Just to name them again, it's step 0, start with yourself. Step 1 is connect, 2, include, 3, create. So if you have any questions for us, we'd love to offer that time and space.
Awesome. Keep on dropping questions into the chat, and we appreciate your share outs because it helps guide us. We know that this is not an ending point of our conversation about capturing the opportunity. We're simply putting something out with a workbook to sort of help make this conversation a little bit easier for leaders around the country. And so as we're thinking about the next part, we'll stop as we see questions, but want to pose a few other things. So some of you might be like, what are other systems? We go much more in depth around other systems and other data points, but want to highlight 4 areas that we're hearing a lot of conversation around. 1, hiring, someone's already brought that up. How we think about teacher recruitment, selection, growth, and the onboarding of new hires. Another one is parent engagement, and you see the pictures over there to the right that are around parent engagement. So you can see how we broke up different marginalized groups, what are the data points we ask people to look, different resources, and what are examples of crafted connect statements. The third one is around transportation, right? So oftentimes we think about the length of routes. Is it your most marginalized kids have to wake up the earliest in the morning to travel to school, and dismissal procedures. And finally, there's this space about instruction. So teacher professional development, criteria for what it actually means for students to be engaged. So these are just some additional systems. And what we challenge is we just want you to start with one, right? Like, let's not wait around. Let's not wait for policies to completely change, but let's find that one system that you have a locus of control over and start the redesign process. And with that, I'm going to shift to some of the questions. Tracy asked, how do you manage staffing with the AM PM instruction? We can talk about master schedules all day. Porby knows this is like probably my favorite thing. And happy to like sign up if that's something you're wanting to do. We'll have like office hours. The idea is we actually plan at a 50-50, 50% virtual, 50% in person. And then it's easier to scale in both directions. Rashonda asks, sorry, I'm trying to make sure I have other questions. Love, I see people saying the idea of scheduling. I think that it is a very pivotal moment in the next 4 to 6 weeks as we think about what does it mean to create a master schedule that is not just replicating or mirror the systems of schedules that worked when we were in person, but actually create a master that captures the amazing opportunities right now that allows interdisciplinary study, that breaks down walls and breaks down the concept of time. And so hopefully this is inspiring you to think about, ooh, what is a system that you want to tackle? But we also want to name that like there are tips for leading through systems equitable change, just because like we know that this work is hard. There's a lot of great people that have attempted this work and that have like felt the struggle and felt the success and win. So we want to give you a few tips. I think the first one that we got from interviewing some leaders within our company, but also in districts, is the idea of like, you really have to dig deep for your strengths, right? Like this is a work where if you are anchored in, you dig deep and you have to know your personal and your personnel biases. So the idea of, from our leadership methodology, that you truly have to know yourself and truly know what brings you the strength to be able to do this work day in and day out. The second one is you really have to nurture trust. Right? Like you can't get discouraged the first time you reach out to your marginalized groups or your stakeholders and they don't engage in conversation, because if they have been systemically disengaged from the conversation, it takes time and multiple attempts to create the safety in which they have the trust to want to engage. And so actually, if you like reach out and you're like not getting any responses back, it's probably a great data point that this group has not been engaged successfully. And so it'll take time, and don't be discouraged in the process, and keep on going back and creating the safety in the relationship. The third thing is how you communicate constantly, right? So you have to be really explicit and transparent on your why for this redesign. Why is this redesign really important? Because oftentimes you might be faced with like, well, my kid, we're all kids, when you're trying to talk about a certain group of marginalized students that the system has not been working for. And so with that, you have to increase the frequency of your reflection as a leader and the frequency of the work itself, and communicating those reflections out and the pivots you make, because that's how you build momentum and people to join you in this process. And finally, it's talking about deciding deliberately. Doing this work means you can't avoid, like you avoid talking in generalities, right? Like, so challenge people to not say, well, this student or student. Challenge people to say like specific groups and specific names, because when we talk in generalities, we can think through that it works for the average, but we know that there aren't many average kids. And so based on that, also, you have to agree on the data before the opinion. So you have to create a space where people are not jumping to solutions, not jumping to generalizations. You just actually agree on what data you're looking at and why before diving in. And so these are sort of our tips for how you think about leading the systems for change, and how you think about, as you're going through this and you're the pivot and you're the person creating this environment, you want to make sure that you're checking in with yourself too, because this work should not be done in isolation, and you have a bunch of people who are your cheerleaders. And Porvi and I are two people that are in your corner just as a result of today.
Yep. And so with that, we want to invite you to connect with us to share learnings and needs via social media, email, or by signing up for office hours. So I'm going to drop that link in the chat. But we'd love to connect with you if you have specific questions about a step in the paper, or more questions about like, this is the system I want to redesign, like how can I apply this process to that system? We'd love to chat more with you. So I put the link in the chat. It's also on the slide, but you can sign up on Calendly for a 30-minute time slot starting next Thursday the 30th. And the paper itself is slated to release early next week. So you should have a copy of that by then as well.
And if you are a leader within a school, feel free to bring your entire team. You're like, why there's only 6? Well, we're deeply passionate about this work, and we want people who want some like guidance and conversation to be able to be available. And it's even more powerful if you actually bring the design team that you're hoping to go through this process with. And by doing that, you can tell us, hey, Porvi and Crystal, walk us through step 0. You might say, actually, we've done step 0 and we've done step 1. We want you to help us think through step 2, but it's really where you are in your journey with the paper and the protocol and the process. So just wanted to name that. It is not just for one, it could be you and your team and your friends.
And then 2 other ways that you can engage. One is with the paper itself. The paper does come with a workbook to guide the conversation in making these school level decisions. Again, it's slated to release early next week, and I believe you'll get an email push out too when it does release. And then share out with your stakeholders and collect feedback. Use social media, use forums for feedback to learn and connect more deeply with any school level challenges that you're facing. Awesome. So for our closeout, we would love for you to pop back on Twitter or share in the chat which system you are inspired to redesign for equity. And our hashtag is #ReturnWithEquity if you want to use it, or tag us with @EdElements, or Crystal and I's Twitter handles are down there as well. I'd love to hear a system that you're feeling inspired to redesign.
Awesome. As you are getting on Twitter and you are checking out, if you don't have Twitter, feel free to use chat to be able to engage in this conversation of which system is top of mind for you.
As you're doing that, just want to name 2 other opportunities if you'd like to continue this conversation. One is a fellowship that Education Elements is launching in the fall, the SEED Fellowship. It's an opportunity for you to deeply examine a system within your district or within your school that you'd like to redesign for equity. And so the fellowship will walk you through that redesign process. Applications, we're collecting them by July 21st, and we can drop the link to that in the chat as well if you're interested in learning more or applying. And then finally, If you're looking to have more conversations like this, we have an upcoming coffee chat around reimagining what professional learning looks like on July 27th, noon Pacific, 3 Eastern, if you'd like to engage with leaders in conversations around professional learning. So those are 2 other opportunities that we'd love to have you join for.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll hang on for a few more minutes as you're asking questions. We want to hear the systems that you're hoping to redesign. Michael already shared one around parent engagement and your title around in your programs. Keep on sharing. Teacher professional development, would love to connect on that. Just keep on sharing what you're thinking about, because this is what we hope to do, to start the iteration of redesign across the country. So with that, we'll close out with some music, and then thank you so much. And we hope to be able to connect with you both in person via Zoom or on Twitter, and see you in the future.